The biggest danger would be for us to relegate what's happening now in Gaza to the actions of a small number of extremist Israeli politicians such as Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir. Now, it's true that this is probably the worst Israeli government that we've ever seen, the most extreme, the most savage. But we cannot separate what's currently happening in Gaza of ethnic cleansing and massacre and displacement and the intentional targeting and the dehumanization of women and children and men to the actions of these mobs. In reality, these are but the continuation of a pervasive ideology and racist idea called Zionism. Now, maybe it's appeared most starkly in the leadership of Netanyahu, but I'll show you in this video how the same ideology pervaded the leaders of the Zionist project right from the beginning. Now, let's begin with Benjamin Netanyahu, the father of Netanyahu, known when he was born as Benjamin Miliotsky. That's in 1910. But when emigrating to Palestine in 1920 as part of the mass Jewish emigrations to the land that didn't belong to them, he decided to heed the advice of David Ben-Gurion to change his name such that to hide the fact that he was a settler colonialist, much like Ben-Gurion, who changed his name from David Green or Grun to David Ben-Gurion. Benzion was a close associate of a man by the name of Joseph Klausner, who he saw as his mentor and his spiritual guide. Klausner adamantly held the view that the Arabs were subhuman half-savages that needed to be dealt with accordingly, the spiritual mentor of Benzion. Also, of the associates of this delinquent, Benzion, whose ideas no doubt brushed off his criminal son, Benjamin, was a man by the name of Abba Ahimaaya, who in the late 1920s wrote a series of 8 articles openly describing himself as a fascist, from the diary of a fascist, and these featured in an Israeli newspaper called Doar Hoyom. So that's the beginning of the rotten tree from which this fraudster and war criminal comes from. But it gets worse. The Likud, which is the party headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, is inspired by an ideology called revisionist Zionism. Now, revisionist Zionism believes in the broader conception and biblical idea of Israel, that it should extend beyond the current boundaries, north as far as Iraq, south into northern Arabia, and east and west into Jordan and Egypt, sparing no human in its way. So the idea of ethnic cleansing and displacement is inherent within the ideology of Zionism, particularly revisionist Zionism, but it gets worse. The father of revisionist Zionism was a man by the name of Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who originally headed the Jewish Legion, an armed contingent of soldiers who fought alongside the British in the Second World War against the Nazis. Ze'ev Jabotinsky went on to form one of the worst, most savage and brutal terrorist organizations during the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, known as the Irgun. Now, the Irgun was responsible for unspeakable atrocities, in particular the massacre of Deir Yassin of 1948, in which 107 villagers at least were butchered for no reason whatsoever, then paraded into the streets of Jerusalem just to make a point and to terrorize the local population of Palestine, just in case they considered putting up arms against the Zionist mobs. The Irgun was also responsible for the largest and most significant single terrorist atrocity suffered by the British, and that's the bombing of the King David Hotel, which was the center of the British mandate over Palestine. 91 British servicemen were massacred in the bombing done by the air gun. And at the time, it was under the command of a man called Menahem Begin. But to reward his actions for bombing the British in the worst terrorist incident they've ever experienced, he became the 6th Prime Minister of Israel. But it gets even worse. One of the offshoots of the Irgun is a group called the Lehi, which was formed by a man called Avraham Stan. The Lehi was slightly different to the Irgun, because whilst the Irgun was anti-British at a specific point in time, the Lehi was formed with that particular purpose to be anti-Western and anti-British. And it focused its operations on European diplomats to such an extent that they tried to forge an alliance with Nazi Germany twice and with fascist Italy also twice. Now the Lehi also produced a prime minister, the 7th Prime Minister of Israel, by the name of Yitzhak Shamir. Now some may argue that the Lehi was declared a terrorist organization by the Israeli state. But in 1949, that proscription was dropped. In fact, the only reason they were declared a terrorist organization was because Europe pushed the hand of Ben Gurion to do such. Now you may say that, okay, what's the big deal? The Lehi and the Irgun and the Haganah, which was under the command of David Ben Gurion, later formed what we call today the IDF. But to add insult to injury, the Israeli army introduced a Lehi ribbon to glorify the achievements of the Lehi in establishing the Zionist entity. And this ribbon is an emblem of honor, in inverted commas, to reward the ex-members of the Lehi, the criminals who used to kill European diplomats for their contribution to establishing the Zionist state. In fact, there's a museum in Tel Aviv called the Lehi Museum. No, there's even a road in Tel Aviv named Avraham Stan, glorifying the founder of this terrorist organization that tried to forge an alliance with Nazism. You might as well have a road in Berlin called Adolf Hitler. It's exactly the same. And on the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Lehi, a party was held. Maybe it was a fringe party by a fringe group. No, it was held in the residence of the President of Israel at the time, Reuven Rivlin. And in the party, they sang the Lehi's favorite song, The Unnamed Soldier. The Lehi also had an underground newspaper that they'd circulate called Ha Chazit. And in one article titled Terror, they said the following: neither Jewish ethics nor Jewish tradition can disqualify terrorism as a means for combat. We are very far from having any moral qualms as far as our national war goes. We have before us the command of the Torah, whose morality surpasses that of any other body of laws in the world. You shall blot them out to the last man. The Lehi, that was later subsumed into the IDF, says very openly that we can't rule out terrorism as a means for combat. So there's no more question as to whether this army is a terrorist or fascist entity. It is a self-declared terrorist and a self-declared fascist entity before we even discuss their heinous actions in intentionally targeting women and children. So it's not just Benjamin Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich. It's a whole web of fascist ideologues that are forwarding the cause of this despicable entity. In fact, in 1948, Yitzhak Rabin, who's considered of Israel's left, oversaw the ethnic cleansing of Al-Lid, in which 500 Palestinian villagers were butchered and 50,000 were displaced, including my very family. So it seems that the only thing that differentiates revisionist Zionists from others is its openness in declaring its genocidal ambitions, as we see in today's government. While European governments are trying to outlaw the statement "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," they maybe forget the fact that the statement originates in the Likud 1977 manifesto, which was stated openly by Menachem Begin. Some journalists, such as Ravit Hecht of the Haaretz newspaper, have gone as far as to say that the statement is a call for ethnic cleansing similar to the one that took place in the Gaza envelope, referring to the actions of October the 7th. But again dismisses the fact that the statement originates in the manifesto of the government that he lives under. And we haven't even touched on the open genocidal, bloodlusting rhetoric that we've heard from politicians at every level, calling for the cutting off of food and aid, declaring that there are no civilians in Gaza, as we heard from Isaac Herzog, the current Israeli president, and brandishing the Palestinians as a modern form of the Amalekites who need to be killed, young and old, woman and man. So the moment somebody tries to relegate the Gazan genocide to the personality of Benjamin Netanyahu, remind them of this history.